Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Yeah, well, you've set yourself up perfectly for the years to come.
Well, let's see, you know.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands, an unceded territory of Indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived in, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those Indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions, and here's how we'll handle Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. You must write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand to hand it to the producer, who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each panelist. For more information, you can find their full bios on the website. And just as way of introduction, my name is Edie Hooton, and I recently retired from the Colorado State Legislature, representing Boulder. And while I was in office, I served as the vice chair of the House Energy and Environment Committee, and advancing public policy to reduce carbon emissions in the electricity sector was one of my legislative priorities. I am honored with the opportunity to moderate the conversation between our esteemed panelists and with you today. Our first panelist I'm happy to introduce is Karl Hausker. And he has a 30-year career in analysis and modeling projects related to climate impacts in the energy sector. He is currently with the World Resource Institute focusing on pathways to achieve net zero emission, electricity market design, and the social cost of carbon. He is also an expert reviewer for the IPCC. Followed by Karl, we'll have Peter Kelly-Detwiler, who comes with 30 years in the electric power industry and consults and publishes on the evolution of the electric power grid and the transformation of competitive power markets. You'll note in his bio that he is also the author of The Energy Switch. Following Peter is Brenna Hughes Neghaiwi, and she is a journalist with a career reporting on climate and finance and is currently a fellow at CU, addressing a core issue of today's discussion. And the question that she is addressing is, can the most disastrous effects of climate change be avoided and social prosperity rebalanced without sacrificing financial returns? Following Brenna is Emma Redfoot, and she has worked in the advanced nuclear sector for the last 5 years. She's been involved in the nonprofit Mothers of Nuclear since 2016 and is currently secretary of their board. Mothers for Nuclear communicates around nuclear as part of the solution to reduce emissions and eliminate energy poverty. If you read, and she is standing in for Heather, who is sick today, but if you had the opportunity to read the bios before participating here, perhaps you found time to read the excellent article in the New Yorker magazine on Mothers for Nuclear. And then sweeping the panel is, oh, I apologize. Sweeping the panel is Mary Wenzel, and she's got a career leading and advising the banking sector and tribal nations on environmental and climate issues. She is just shy of her first year with the Nature Conservancy as the Director of Corporate Engagement. So with that, each panelist will have 3 to 5 minutes to make their statements. When they're complete with those statements, they have an opportunity to ask each other questions and have a brief discussion. I will kick off with a question, and then when they've had the opportunity to answer that question, we will take questions from the audience, and obviously we want to reserve the majority of our time for you. So thank you. Karl, take it away, please.
Thanks
Thank you.
Much. And as a former legislator, I have to ask you, am I able to expand and revise my remarks after I finish my remarks?
That would be in the hands of the AV department. They could do all the editing for you.
The woman persists.
Yes.
Okay. We're here to talk about in part, the deployment of technologies to solve the climate crisis. And I'm going to set the stage for that discussion by repeating something I said in the morning panel. So sorry if you're hearing it for a second time, but for some of you the first time. What we need to do to take our CO2 emissions down to net zero can actually be summarized in a fairly simple way, which is, number one, we just have to be as efficient as possible with all of our energy use and therefore decrease our total energy needs. Second, we need to electrify as many end uses as possible. And there's a lot we can do there. We can electrify our cooking, our water heating, our space heating in our buildings. We can electrify many forms of transportation, and we can electrify many forms of industrial heat. So number two, electrify everything possible. And then third, not surprisingly, we have to produce a lot more electricity than we do now, and we need to convert it all to zero carbon sources. There's sort of a fourth strategy. We need to capture carbon where we're still burning fossil fuels in the power sector or industry. So you can say there's really 4 things we have to do that are fairly easy to wrap our arms around, and that we have most of the technologies ready to go to do those. On the electricity side, which is a big focus of what we're going to talk about today, I would convey the following. The cost of solar and wind has dropped dramatically over the last 10 years, and that is great news. That means that we're going to be able to do this more cheaply than we thought in 2010. However, some people go a little overboard and think, oh, we can provide all the electricity we need just with solar and wind and some batteries. Most mainstream modelers and analysts disagree, and I put myself in that camp. We need to complement a heavy solar and wind system with some zero carbon firm sources, dispatchable sources of power. Could be advanced geothermal, could be nuclear, could be some natural gas with carbon capture, or maybe some things we haven't invented yet. But it's very important to know that we will need a mixture of electricity sources going forward, both the solar and wind, which it seems everybody likes, and maybe some other sources that people are not that excited about right now, but we got to look at that firmly in the face. So with that stage setting, I will turn it back.
Thank you. Peter.
What he said. I mean, really, this comes down to what's the problem you're trying to solve. And at the high level, it's carbon. And then it gets down into more subtle issues. So for example, electrifying everything, right? First, make it more efficient, like Karl said, then bring the electron into everything from transportation to heating to all the other things that you're doing. One of the challenges there is, some experts think that the grid might actually have to triple in size between now and 2050 in order to electrify everything. The challenge there isn't that we don't have the technology to do it in terms of wind, solar, batteries, modular nuclear, perhaps even fusion in the future. The real challenge in many ways is going to be issues such as transmission. How do you get, for example, from the wind-rich spine of the country or the solar-saturated southwestern states, how do you get that really cheap electron from there to the centers of demand? And right now, that's a political issue. We can build all the transmission lines we want, and you can build them in a couple of years. But the process of so doing politically takes 10, 12, 13 years or more sometimes. So that's one piece of it. But if you step back and talk about this from an innovation perspective, there's a pathway that technologies typically go through. And by way of background, I've been 30 years in the industry. What I do now is I get up in the morning around 6 and I read 2 to 3 hours. I have 32 newsletters that I read every day. And when I see an incipient technology that looks like it could be interesting, for example, there's a storage technology out there which we desperately need storage, and not just 4 hours of lithium batteries, but stuff that can save energy and hold it for 10 hours, 12 hours, days. So if there's a front that stalls coming through the range here and you don't have wind power, or there's an atmospheric river in California and 5 days of rain, you still have the megawatt hours and the gigawatt hours that you need. So there are storage technologies. There's one, for example, NASA scientists are looking at breaking carbon dioxide, and the carbon turns into powder, and the oxygen gets stored, and they do it in tanks. They've just raised their first $20 million. Will they make it or not? The question's going to come down to scale and cost. One of the critical things about technology adoption, the software side is not that hard because it's a bunch of people coding, and pretty soon we won't need them because ChatGPT is going to do it for us. I mean, there are already people using ChatGPT for code now. So don't raise your sons and daughters to be coders. The issue really is, for a lot of these technologies, whether it's nukes, whether it's batteries, can we scale them? And one of the reasons that lithium-ion is the reigning technology today in batteries is because the Chinese make 80% of the batteries in the world, and the supply chain has gotten so efficient because every time we double the cumulative global output, the costs fall between 23 and 28%. Same thing happened with solar panels. And so when we move into some of these other technologies, the ones that are more likely to win are the ones that we can manufacture in a modular fashion and lather, rinse, repeat volumetrically, so that they become more and more cost effective. As innovators and financiers, we look for those kinds of technologies to help solve our problems because they're easier to bring into the overall marketplace. So there's a migration path for new tech and finance and so on, but those are some of the main things that we have to think about as we look to the technologies of the future. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Hi all, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to Karl and Peter. The story that I want to tell is one about value. It's the question, what do we value and how do we value it? So this story is going to start during the COVID-19 pandemic in the year 2020. At the time, I was working as a financial reporter for Reuters in Zurich. I covered the big Swiss banks there and also an area of finance called wealth management. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with it, but it's also can be known as private banking. It's the area of finance which covers the banking needs of the world's wealthy, the 1%. I don't know how closely you all were following the stock market in March 2020, but if you were following at the time, you might remember a very dramatic drop that we saw in stock valuations. And at the same time, in fiscal spending, an unprecedented move to release a great deal of stimulus, unprecedented across many different geographies and nations to the broader public. Of course, later that year, we saw stocks rebound and make a dramatic recovery, leading to the billionaire class at the start of 2021 entering the year with nearly double, of nearly 50% increase on the wealth that they would have seen pre-pandemic. And at this point in time, working with some of my colleagues, we became interested in, well, not only what are bankers thinking about this, but how are the wealthy responding? And at the time, we saw, for the first time, really in quite some time, great concern among the billionaire class regarding inequality. What do we do about this? How do we address this? And during this time, we also saw a rise in the concern for sustainability and issues like the climate within finance. You saw the financial sphere beginning to look to the world outside and see that finance doesn't exist within a vacuum, but operates within the context of a world that needs to be doing well as well for finance to do well. And from there, I sort of came to the question of, okay, well, what do you do with that? How do you respond to that? How does that become integrated into finance? And I looked at this niche called impact investment. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with it, but it's an area often functioning outside of public markets, which deals with often private investors, but sometimes institutional investors who have the idea that they want to do good in the world. And they're not going to be focused simply on the financial returns, but the impact that their investments have on the world. And so talking to people within this niche, became clear, yes, there are areas where you can do well and do good at the same time. Financial and impact can be aligned. But then when you sort of zoom out and you look at the broader economy, you see how much needs to change. And that you can't just focus on sort of the best and the worst components of the economy, but you really, it's broad transformation that is needed. And when we're looking at a world in which you're dealing with material limits, the math for growth doesn't add up when you look across the scale, because some companies can do well and grow at the same time. But across the board, we have material limits. And when you're looking at downsizing, that can't be multiplied infinitely. And so the approach that I'm taking here is really looking at how do we adjust what we value? Because I think it's a collective action problem. Are we looking at individual gains, or are we looking at public gains and collective gains? And I think when you're looking at barriers to technologies and also to bringing about transformative change, the component that really needs to be included is an accounting that doesn't just take into account how will this project perform for my company, for my economy, but what will it do for the greater good?
Thank you. Emma, thank you.
Well, I really appreciate being on this panel, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why I became a nuclear engineer, and I think that that story will have some themes that have been brought up by all the other panelists so far. So I grew up in Montana. I spent a lot of time backpacking and snowboarding and spending time outside, and recognized that climate change was likely going to be the issue of my generation. And that really inspired me to pursue a degree in environmental studies from Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, which I don't know if there's any environmental studies majors out there, but it can be a pretty upsetting degree to get because you end up focusing basically on all the problems that we're facing. It also helps you grow to recognize that the environment is everything. It's humans. There's nothing that shouldn't be incorporated in that notion. While I was getting that degree, I spent 6 months and I lived on an organic permaculture farm on the coast of Ecuador. And that's where I started to see inequity and started to see the challenges that come with some of the more, like some solutions that people propose to climate change. So that was one area where it was amazing, it was beautiful, it was a wonderful place to be. But I also saw what it meant for people to not have access to energy. So that experience inspired me to get a grant, and then I moved to Cusco, Peru, and I lived there for 6 months, and I studied 32 different NGOs that did different things for the community. What I learned from that experience was that the people who live in those communities are the ones that make the biggest impact. So even people that are coming from, like in Cusco, a lot of the people who are coming from other parts of Peru weren't as effective as the people coming from that local community, let alone people from the United States coming to these communities and telling people what to do. So from those experiences, I came back to the US and I knew from my environmental studies degree that increased energy consumption has been correlated with increased access to education, increased access to healthcare, and women's rights improving. And that's largely due to basically having jobs and resources out of the home. And some of the NGOs I studied in Cusco were focused on women who had very little opportunity, especially indigenous people in that community. So after kind of recognizing like energy accessibility is going to be important for inequality in the world and for people being able to live the lives they want to live, and also recognizing that climate change is still one of the most important, along with kind of energy accessibility, is one of the most important issues of our world today, let alone air pollution and the other things that are impacted due to our energy choices. I spent like a year reading different books on energy and researching energy. And that kind of inspired me to go back to school and get all my engineering prereqs and get a master's in nuclear engineering. So, because once I did the research, I saw nuclear as being an important part of our energy solutions. It's something where it's proven to being able to rapidly decarbonize and power industrialized nations. So that's kind of why I became a nuclear engineer. During that process, before I even started my nuclear degree, I started advocating for nuclear along with Mothers for Nuclear, which started out of California in Diablo Canyon, which in 2016. And so that's an interesting story to talk about incentives and how these technologies that produce emissions-free power can continue to meet our nation's energy goals. Thanks.
Thank you, Emma. And now we've got Mary. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. And very supportive of all that was said on the panel. I think importantly the comment that, before you develop a clean tech solution, you need to understand a problem you're trying to solve and address. And we know and have mentioned the many different barriers to more rapid scaling and adoption of clean technology, from policy barriers to the need to reduce costs, to the need for access to long-term sustainable financing for these entrepreneurs, to the need for de-risking the technology through scale-ups and pilots. And one of the roles I had when I was at Wells Fargo was to lead our sustainability philanthropy efforts. And through that, we had a $50 million partnership with the National Renewable Energy Lab. And we launched a program called the Innovation Incubator. And that program was exactly what it sounds like. It was meant to speed the commercialization and development of clean technologies. And we focused first on building technologies and second on ag technologies because that aligned with Wells Fargo's footprint. Wells Fargo not only had a big footprint itself, but was the largest financier of commercial real estate and the largest ag lender in the US. So we partnered with NREL for the investigating and supporting clean tech entrepreneurs working on buildings technologies, and we partnered with the Danforth Plant Science Center in Missouri on agricultural technologies. And so the program, we worked with incubators and accelerators across the country to identify and filter kind of leading technologies that solved specific solutions. Each fund we did, each round we did, we were seeking technologies that addressed different challenges. And through these incubators and accelerators, we kind of down-selected till we got to a set of entrepreneurs that were able to access non-dilutive capital, were able to have their technologies tested and validated at the NREL facilities or the Danforth Plant Science Center, and then hopefully were able to be piloted in a real-world environment. And we found that combination of support to these entrepreneurs was quite useful. And I'm going to read the statistics because they've changed a little bit since I left Wells, and I want to make sure I get the numbers right. So Wells had invested about $50 million in that program. The companies that went through that program were able to raise $1.8 billion in follow-on funding. So it was $97 for every dollar that Wells invested in the program. And 11 of the 65 entrepreneurs that went through the program were able to successfully exit through some type of merger or acquisition. And so, you know, there are targeted solutions that can help these entrepreneurs really move more quickly to commercialization. So I think that's one of the things we need to focus on is what is really supportive of this ecosystem and how do we help get these technologies to market more quickly because we know we need it.
Thank you, Mary. All right. So this portion of the program, panelists have an opportunity to ask questions of each other or make comments. So I'll give you a moment to think about that, and then we'll move on. Any questions or comments?
I just want to really emphasize one aspect and build on a little bit of what Peter said. That much larger electricity system that we need to stop burning coal, oil, and gas requires not only the siting of a lot of solar, a lot of siting of wind, and then some siting of things like small modular reactors, gas with carbon capture, et cetera, and a mass, was that a thumbs down in the front row? Oh. And a massive expansion of the transmission system to link all these together. Particularly one way to make solar and wind more reliable is to aggregate it over a larger and larger geographic area. And so, but all of that construction faces massive NIMBY problems across the U.S. And one thing that the U.S. needs to figure out is how to permit and site and build a lot of stuff. And that almost goes against the grain of a lot of the environmental movement of the last 30 years, because a lot of that movement has been about stopping stuff. Well, we've got to have a pretty big paradigm shift, and we have to build a lot of clean energy facilities and the transmission to link it together. And that's a challenge for all of us as citizens, legislators, business people, government employees.
Yeah, I just want to chime in. The Nature Conservancy does have a guide on right siting for energy resources. So that's something that I do think some of the NGO community is starting to work on and identify as a critical need.
Great. All right, then. We'll just move on to a general question. And that is that the subject of today's conversation is incentives and barriers to scaling new technologies. And the Inflation Reduction Act is built on a strong foundation of tax credits and is designed to attract investment, so its implementation will benefit from the private sector's expertise. The question is, what are your organization's most promising technologies or strategies for attaining a 50% reduction in net zero emissions by 2030 and 100% by 2050? How are you taking advantage of the incentives available through the Inflation Reduction Act and possibly the Build Back Better program to achieve those reductions? Who would like to go first? Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, let's look at solar for a second. Okay, so it started in Germany. Germany started paying, this is like a decade and a half ago, maybe even a little longer, feed-in tariffs. So if people put solar on their rooftops, they got paid like 35 cents a kilowatt hour, irrespective of how much they used. It just was, they were little power plants exporting to the grid. The subsidy was rich enough that a lot of people put solar on their rooftops, which scaled the industry, which attracted the Chinese, who bought up a lot of the German companies, and manufactured at scale and drove the cost down from the silicon to the wafers to the cells to the finished modules. That whole industry now is overseas. We get now 80% of our panels from Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, with most of the inputs, or a lot of them, from China. The good thing, the IRA has done a lot of really good things. One thing, in my opinion, that's really good is that there are domestic incentives for manufacturing. For example, steel. If your steel is 100% US steel for wind turbines or the racks for solar, you get X% of carbon credits. If the modules are domestically sourced, et cetera. This year in the United States, more than 50% of the solar, of all the capacity installed, new generating capacity in this country, will be solar. Last year was a little bit less. It will be 29,000 megawatts, which doesn't mean that much to you all, except to say that's the installed capacity of ISO New England right now, of all 6 New England states. So it's a lot of solar going in. We don't now have that domestic manufacturing capacity, but since the IRA has come in, over $40 billion worth of new announcements have been made by companies like Hanwha Q-Cells, which is Korean, and they're going to put in silicon manufacturing and ingot manufacturing in Moses Lake, Washington State. They've announced another huge facility in the southeast United States. So I'm hopeful that over the next 4 or 5 years, we will regain a lot of these industries that we've offshored. And by the way, they'll be cleaner. The panels we manufacture here won't be based on coal-based electricity. They'll be based on the cleaner power grid generation that we have. So that will help the planet too. Those kinds of models for innovation and onshoring and internal economic development create good, solid, long-term paying jobs, a lot of union jobs, and they create a more healthy economic, vibrant economic future for our children. So I'm really pleased with what I have seen in the IRA in terms of those domestic components. That has a huge potential. For the first time in decades, those of you with gray hair know, we haven't had an industrial policy in this country for decades, and for the first time, we now have at least the beginnings of one. One clap.
Okay, thank you. Well, we do have some questions from students, so we'll start out with them. Lots of great questions from the audience. I'm sure no one's surprised about that. So our first question is, how can we ensure the transition to sustainable energy systems is just and equitable, particularly for those who have historically been disproportionately affected by climate change? Emma, do you want to address that, or Mary? I'm sorry, Emma. I meant Brenna or Mary. But Emma, actually, if you would like to weigh in, this would be okay. I apologize.
I go for it.
Okay. All right. Why don't we take turns? Emma, why don't you start? Because I know this is a real concern of Mothers for Nuclear, is equitability. So in the energy sector. And
yeah, and
so
I mean,
please.
environmental justice is clearly something that is incredibly important generally and incredibly important to this administration. Nuclear, I have a lot of issues with the nuclear industry itself. The technology is amazing, but the industry has not been great about integrating local communities and listening and putting these in places people want them. There's definitely a heavy focus on consent-based siting now, and so it is, okay, how do we do this where we listen to what people want, we put these in places people want. For this next generation of nuclear that's coming out, for it to be successful, you need to put it where people want it. So a lot of it comes down to listening and putting it where people want it. So,
Mary?
I previously served on the board of a nonprofit that was called Grid Alternatives, and Grid Alternatives has a kind of sustainability and equity mandate, and it's about ensuring that all communities have access to both clean energy jobs and clean energy benefits. And so they did a lot of job training to bring folks from low-income communities into the solar field and enable them to become solar installers. And they also worked to install solar on low-income housing to ensure that all communities had the economic benefits that come from solar energy. And I think as Emma said, it requires an intentionality. It requires an intentionality to engage local communities, to ensure they have a voice in energy issues in their communities, and then a second intentionality around skills training and reaching out to communities, either to reskill people that are impacted by job losses from the energy transition, or to bring new communities into clean energy opportunities.
Thank you. Brenna, did you want to make a comment? Or just from the perspective of a journalist, what you've seen, and I'm happy to to repeat the question. And it has to do with equitability and how can we ensure the transition to sustainable energy systems is just and equitable.
So maybe I could talk less on the finance side, but a little bit about some of the environmental justice and I can talk a little bit about some of the environmental justice work I've been involved with or been looking into during my time here, which is related to equity issues and environmental justice issues in the Commerce City and Denver areas. As perhaps some of you from the area are aware of some of the refining and industrial activity around those areas. And in northern Denver, you have several disproportionately impacted communities in neighborhoods that are much more black and brown than the broader Denver metro area. And some of you might also be familiar with the tax that the tax that was voted in Denver. I believe might have been in 2021. It was a new tax that was established, a sales tax to bring funds into the Office for Climate Action of the City of Denver, which is looking to make the city net zero by 2050, but also have half of those funds be allocated to disproportionately impacted communities. And so I think that when you're looking at energy transition initiatives like that, which are specifically going to address disproportionately impacted communities and having half or a majority of funding allocated to those are important. But you also need to look at other measures such as like the real issue of gentrification. If you're cleaning up pollution in communities, you have the issue that those same communities, as improvements are made, can become susceptible to be pushed out by the very measures put in place to make improvements. And so then you need to look at things like provisions for affordable housing and other policies.
Great, thank you. Okay, our next question is, and this may be a good question for you, Karl, because it concerns the IPCC. But the question is, what is the most reliable source of information on climate change? There's a lot of information out there. Thoughts?
Why did that draw some chuckles from the audience?
Peter mentioned he spends 2 hours first thing in the morning just reading his newsletters.
And read his book. That's
Yes.
good. Go to the World Resources Institute website, and the IPCC, for some of you who know, it's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it does represent the most authoritative source on the science of climate, the impacts we're experiencing and will affect and will be impacted by in the future, and then the mitigation strategies we need. Approximately every 8 years or so, this body, managed, as I believe, as a UN-managed organization, puts out a comprehensive report. Last month, the 8th assessment was released in the form of the synthesis report. Bigger reports were issued over the last 2 years again. And it's amazing. These reports, the full reports, can be 2,000 or more pages long. And then there's a technical summary that's about 150 pages, plus or minus. And then there is a summary for policymakers, and that's 30 to 50 pages long. It's sort of like a three-layer cake. And sadly, or rightly or wrongly, most policymakers, most members of the public, stakeholders, most journalists never get beyond the summary for policymakers. But there's a lot of detail that simply cannot make it in there. And in fact, as an expert reviewer on the mitigation report and the synthesis report over the last 2 years, I noticed that, for instance, nuclear is treated as an important part of the solution in the 2,000-page report of work group number 3. It's treated in the technical summary of 150 pages, but when you get down to the summary for policymakers, which had to be approved by 190 governments in the UN, the word nuclear kind of disappeared. So the IPCC is the most authoritative source, but sadly, sometimes the consensus process of producing that 30 to 50-page summary can leave important items out.
Thank you, Peter.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add a quick note.
real quick, yep.
This might be useful for Peter. Unfortunately, it's in German, but there was...
Ich kann das mal lesen. Also.
I actually, I guess the 3 reports cumulatively of the 6th assessment, 10,000 pages or something? Yeah, it's a lot to get through, but there is, however, a fantastic German language podcast where over the course of 1.5 years, the podcast presenters, who are both scientists, go through week by week each chapter and brings it down to, I guess, however, maybe only 70 hours of listening, so a little bit shorter.
With some super technical terms in there, you can be.
I was just going to say, I'm sad to hear it's only in German, and ich spreche Deutsch, but I actually planted a great idea that someone should do an English language version of that. Thank you for that idea. Sorry.
Other resources that are worth looking into from a U.S. perspective, the U.S. National Climate Assessment. And also, if you've been on NOAA's website and you look at things like ice coverage, they have all kinds of graphs and charts around what's happening with Arctic ice and what's going on with the South Pole as well. They've got sea level models on the NOAA website. They've got regional temperature maps and forecasts and projections. So when you kind of want to figure out how does this boil down to me and where I live, the NOAA website can be really helpful to pulling more information out. And you all also have your You have a monthly summary called WRI sends out that newsletter, right? Which is really helpful.
I
You know
paid
the one?
Peter to say that. Yes, we have.
Yeah, it's a
we have a great
scary
collection of-
compilation.
You can
Yeah.
sign up for a newsletter on our website. You can read our blogs. And thanks also for noting the U.S. climate assessment, which again, I think is very, very accessible and attempts to communicate to the general public.
Okay, thank you. Okay, our next question. What are the leading tech candidates for long-term storage? And do flow batteries appear to be one solution?
All right, I guess this one's mine. I'll try and keep it really fast. The lithium-ion batteries we have today are cost-effective to 4 to 6 hours. After that, it doesn't make sense. Flow batteries, what they involve typically is a membrane in the middle that determines how much you can get instantaneously, and then you add tanks and tanks and tanks and tanks of electrolytes on each side that give you more and more hours of duration. The problem is they haven't built those in volumes to drive the scale and then the cost down. There are some models out there. Sacramento Municipal Utility District has contracted for 2,000 megawatt hours of flow batteries. Hopefully that gets done. The other technologies out there that are interesting for longer duration storage, compressed air. You take air, you compress it, you put it into steel vessels, off-the-shelf stuff that the gas industry uses. When you heat up that air that's liquefied, it expands 700 times, spins a turbine, creates electricity. The problem is you lose 40% of the electricity in the round trip. It's a 60% round trip efficiency versus lithium ion, which is about 90% round trip efficiency. The technology I'm most excited about today is something called Form Energy's reverse rust. Neil Young was right, rust never does sleep. And what you do is you take iron, and when it rusts and oxidizes, it releases energy. And then you derust it by using energy to derust it. And you can build these things big. Xcel Energy right here just signed a contract with Form for 10 megawatts and 1,000 megawatt hours, so 100 hours of duration. They just raised $450 million, and they're going to build their first gigafactory, it looks like West Virginia. The biggest problem there is round-trip efficiencies. You lose 60% of the energy in the round trip each time. So what you want to do is harvest really, really cheap solar and wind and store it for those periods of time. And then the last technology, which you're going to start to hear more and more about because the US DOE is spending $7 billion on 6 to 10 hydrogen hubs, is hydrogen. And what you do is you take electricity and you take water and separate it into H2 and then O2, and you store it in a huge salt cavern somewhere, representing gigawatt hours or terawatt hours of energy in these massive salt caverns that cost billions of dollars. Then you take that hydrogen, you compress it, you run it through pipelines, you put it through a power plant or fuel cells and generate electricity. That could be used for interseasonal. You know, you have lots of sunshine in the summer, not a lot in the winter, periods when the wind blows a lot, other times you don't. You store all that energy in caverns and then run it through turbines. The challenge there is you lose 2/3 of the electricity. The round-trip efficiencies are about 35%. So there's a lot of different storage technologies out there, and the balance is always the efficiency, those round-trip efficiencies, and the costs, the capital costs up front, and then what you're feeding into it in terms of the cost of the electricity in versus what you're getting out and the value that you're using for reliability or other reasons. So I basically just gave you my 7.5-hour course in about 2.5 minutes.
That's great, thank you.
I just want to build on what Peter said a little bit because this is so important. And because we're throwing German words around, I'll throw out my favorite German word that I learned as a climate geek, Dunkelflaute, the dark doldrums. This is something that Germany invented this word to describe the 10, 12, 14 days, almost every winter when they are very cloudy and the wind drops and their solar and wind output drops to very low levels. This is the challenge of long-duration storage. Peter just described a number of ways we might overcome it. However, what I find is a number of renewable advocates who say, we want nothing but solar and wind and renewables. Don't worry, we'll solve the long-duration storage problem. They might be right. One of these things might come through at a reasonable cost. But in my mind, we don't want to bet the farm on that. We don't want to bet the planet on that. That's why we need to conduct the R&D across multiple options, all the long-duration storage options that Peter described, but also put some of our chips in the betting parlor on nuclear, on gas with CCS, on advanced geothermal, and massive production of hydrogen. One way or the other, we have to keep the lights on, even during the Dunkelflautes that also occur in the US and occur across the globe, except maybe Saudi Arabia, where the sun always shines at least 12 hours a day.
It's an all of the above approach right now. I recognize there are concerns with nuclear, there are concerns with transmission, all that stuff. If we break this thing apart and oppose every single thing, 5% of us are going to oppose this and kill it, 10% that over there, 10% over here. Atmospheric chemistry gives not a damn about our ideology. It is going to do what it is going to do based upon the carbon accumulations in the atmosphere. It's a luxury to oppose these transmission lines, different types of technologies. It's a luxury we don't have anymore.
Okay, I've got several questions for Emma, and they're very similar. So let's see if we can just combine them. What are some of the changes you can imagine in the future with nuclear energy? And what are some of the possible negatives? And along those lines, do you think that nuclear-powered cars are a viable alternative to EVs? Well, obviously, it's all electricity, so I think maybe to rephrase the question, would nuclear-generated electricity rapidly advance the electrification of the transportation sector?
Yeah, it's very exciting to see that the transportation center is being electrified. I would definitely advocate for that route in terms of, let's have, we need what is clear from this panel, I think, is that we need a lot of power. And the scale of what we need for energy resources cannot be overstated. That's one thing that I found when I was doing my research is, and everything we talked about, the discussion about batteries just now or different storage methodologies, we need so much power, so much more power than I think any of us can actually conceptualize, because we're dealing with both replacing all of our fossil fuel energy resources as well as providing power, clean energy for much of the world that does not have any access to power or has very unreliable access to power. In terms of exciting, there's lots of things that are exciting in nuclear. There's a reason that that's what I just chose to work in. As noted in my bio, while I do Mothers for Nuclear is something I do in my free time. This isn't a hobby. I work on advanced nuclear. And there's a lot of exciting technologies there. The things that I'm most excited about, recycling of what is now considered used nuclear fuel or spent nuclear fuel, or what most people call nuclear waste. So 95% of what is considered nuclear waste is actually reusable. We have 150 years of powering the United States on our nuclear waste alone. So that's something that is incredibly exciting, and there are commercial efforts right now to tap into that as an energy source, which also removes mining as an impact on top of everything else and helps mitigate the burden of nuclear waste. So that's a big one. I think that all of the different technologies that are coming out have a lot of different benefits associated with them. So some advanced reactor designs are really high temperature, so that can be used for process heat for all kinds of different industrial facilities. And so we can move away from using large coal for things like hydrogen production, as well as synthetic fuels production, as well as desalination. And so there's a lot of process heat applications that are very exciting. In terms of, I guess, the third part of the question there is, what are some of the negatives associated with nuclear power, which, nuclear is, I'm really excited about nuclear because it provides reliable, clean, scalable power. That's why I got into this. People don't think about the positives of nuclear when they think about nuclear initially. what I learned because I didn't used to think about this stuff. I wasn't like raised in a pro-nuclear family. It's something that like I learned about and came to the conclusion that it's important. What I also learned is that a lot of the problems that people perceive with nuclear are things that there's been a lot of progress on, including things like the waste that I just talked about. And a lot of these, also noting like advanced nuclear technologies and what's exciting there, a lot of this is not new. And so there's, like the term advanced is kind of a funny one to me because these advanced nuclear technologies have been around since the 1950s. We haven't commercialized them, but it's something that there's a lot of good data out there. These have been operated around the world commercially, and it's very exciting to see them being deployed in an electricity market that's dramatically changing to more small local energy generation sources, which has largely been driven by wind and solar. So small modular reactors, advanced reactors, can be part of that transition. So yeah, those are some points.
Great, thank you. Next question. Are we entering a new era of environmentalism where we're becoming more mature, i.e. not always having a knee-jerk no reaction to development, but now acknowledge necessity of trade-offs? And I think we did touch on this earlier, but if anyone wants to expand or jump in who hasn't spoken to this issue. I think Carbon's not giving a whit about their source probably really spoke to this question, but it was a student question.
There was, can I, one thing, The
Yeah, go
Economist,
ahead,
did you
Peter.
see The Economist cover like 2 weeks ago? Environmentalists, hug your pylons. And it showed someone hugging a transmission line, right? And it was talking about old environmentalism, with all due respect to all of us, and new environmentalism, which is recognizing the bigger macro problem and understanding that's where we have to start rethinking our focus.
Okay,
Maybe
thank you.
just
Yeah, go ahead, Brenna, please.
addition I would like to make is I think there's so many different moving parts, and this needs to really be thought through on a systems level better. And I think what needs the moves from both policy, law, and regulation really need to be clear. This has become a massive issue in financing, right? At the moment, this has become a political issue, but it's also become an issue with things like competition. If we share information, is that even, are we violating any rules? This has been very recently a barrier in terms of asset managers, insurers pulling out of these larger collective action efforts because of the concerns of regulation. And so I think it's not only what are individual actors doing, but how does the system, how do the rules we have in place enable them to, make the investments that are going to be necessary to have this unprecedented infrastructural change.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm going to add one thing. So I do think that we're entering a different type of environmental movement. I think that we're moving away from having like a set of solutions that should be applied, and there's a move away from a dogmatic approach and more of a focus on, okay, the goal is emissions reduction. That's it. We need to reduce. We need to do that. We need to do that as quickly as possible, and we need to do that as equitably as possible. And one thing I found, I worked at Diablo Canyon, and I did not find that to be a place where there was a lot of people who were driven by climate change. The nuclear industry was not a group of people it's a lot of people who came out of the Navy a long time ago. And one thing that I find really hopeful is, there is this generation of people going into nuclear for climate change reasons. And it's an incredible group to be around. It's very inspiring. When I go to events that are about climate change that have pro-nuclear people there, they're young. And so it's a bunch of young people getting involved to advocate for the technologies that they see as important to emissions reductions. So.
Great. Okay, next question. Heating and cooling of a house is one of the core elements that are the most difficult to steer away from fossil fuels because of the cost of heating. Solutions, including heat pumps and the passive solar, yet there seem to be few solutions in this area. So perhaps you might be able to address that, I think, and also the Inflation Reduction Act, perhaps incentives around there. But if anyone here would like to address that, please do.
Sure, heat pumps are a really efficient technology. Many of you know them as the mini split units that you see, in people's homes, the little thing where the vent opens up on the side of the wall. It's not the window shakers we used to have. They're really efficient in terms of taking heat out of the atmosphere or cold and transferring that heat into the house. And the new ones, by the way, are effective at 0 degrees centigrade or Fahrenheit, I should say, getting really good. They've made a lot of strides in cold weather heat pumps. Last year, for the first time in this country, there were more heat pumps sold than gas heating units for the first time. And if you go to places like Asia, Singapore, Taiwan, any place over there, you see heat pumps everywhere. I mean, everyone's got a Fujitsu or a Mitsubishi or whatever. So it's not a new technology. Other societies around the world know how to use them, have been using them a longer time than we have. The biggest risk, I would say, is if you have a power outage and you're dependent upon electricity and the grid's down for a couple of days and you've got a heat pump to keep you warm and or alive, there's some risk involved in that. Let's be honest about that. But it is a very efficient technology, and many state governments are pushing it, and the IRA has subsidies to push more beneficial electrification of space heating and cooling.
Okay. All right. Along the same lines.
Oh, ground source heat pumps are great. You dig a hole in the ground, you take advantage of the fact the ground's 50 degrees all the time. The problem is you got to dig holes. And you have to have enough surface area of the pipes in there for the heat transfer fluid to work. And so there's a couple they're doing right now in my area in Massachusetts. They're cost effective. They're great for new construction. They're a lot harder for retrofits. Okay.
Okay, we're not having a
it depends
debate.
if you're in a built space and you're digging in neighbors' yards and all that stuff. It depends how much space you have. That's the real critical issue, is the exposure of the surface area to the size of the house that you're trying to heat. But it is a very efficient technology, even more so than air source, and doesn't have any exposure to cold weather.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. In changing from gas-fired boilers to electric-fired boilers and water heaters, could induction be, as with induction cookstops, be a possible system that could be employed?
I can't take that either.
Yeah, I don't know that one.
Anyone here know about
Stump the
induction?
panel. I think you've stumped the panel. Thank you.
Okay.
I love my induction cooktop.
Okay, and there is a question about upgrading the transmission and distribution system to make it more resilient. And along those lines, could someone here please address distributed energy?
You want to
Take
start?
T&D and you
Yeah.
take distributed?
Okay, cool. I'm down with
Great
that.
tag team. Not only do we need more transmission lines and distribution lines, again, as we electrify the economy, but we also need to make that whole system more resilient. As many of you know, wildfires can take out transmission systems. There are also more intense storms, which is an impact of climate change, can take down power lines. There may be even some areas where flooding could affect the transmission distribution system. Certainly we saw that when New York flooded. So there's a number of ways to increase that resilience. It all costs money. Sometimes you want to underground your lines to avoid wildfires and weather disturbances. But if you're really near the coast, maybe you don't want to underground your power lines. So it's complex, but all of it means that, yeah, this stuff is not free. Having a resilient, highly electrified economy, it's not going to break the bank, but it's not free either.
So for DERs, distributed energy resources, our typical power grid that we use today is 41% efficient. That is, if you take its size to deliver 100 units, on average, we deliver 41 over the course of the year. It'd be like if we flew our airplanes 40% full. All of us could stretch out and sleep, but we'd pay higher prices for our tickets. Because our grid is sized to deliver electricity on that hottest day of the year in poorly insulated environments in many cases without a blackout. And we plan for a loss of load every 10 years, right? So we supersize all of our infrastructure. Now, what that means is it's really wasteful. Now we're going to do this beneficial electrification. Last year we sold 800,000 electric vehicles, 5.8% of all the vehicles sold. We're putting heat pumps in, all that stuff. So we have end-use devices like our water heaters. We can move over from gas to water. We can heat water at the right times of the day and not the wrong times of the day. In California, we can tummy tuck the duck and take that surplus solar in the middle of the day and warm water with it, right? We can also use it, basically putting energy in really quick bursts to provide frequency services to hold the grid at 60 hertz. So end-use devices we can play with. Then we have electric vehicles. Like I just said, 800,000 sold last year. If we electrify the entire fleet of light trucks, passenger vehicles, and 60% of the medium-duty vehicles, it would represent 40% of today's electricity consumption. Assume those batteries are full half the time, that's 20% of all the electricity we use today that sits on wheels and gets utilized 5% of the time and sits idle the rest. Batteries on wheels. Vehicle to grid is coming. There is a program that just ended in the UK where 320 Nissan Leaf users got paid 3 million miles of driving for free because their vehicles interacted with the grid. Then you have rooftop solar. In California alone, there are 1.6 million rooftop solar arrays delivering 14,000 megawatts of electricity into like a 50,000 megawatt system. And now that they've changed the rules, 80% of the new solar arrays in California are going to have batteries attached to them. All those batteries can be harnessed, and those EVs, to push down the top of the grid and pull up the corners and make the grid, instead of 40% efficient, say 50 or 60. So we can harness with, especially artificial intelligence, with machine learning and the right grid architectures, all these distributed elastic devices that can respond to prices and grid signals to make a much better, much more efficient power grid of the future without having to build out a lot of future infrastructure. Smarter, not more.
I agree with him, but I have to leave 5 minutes early to go to the airport. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. This question is directed specifically to Brenna, but I think Mary might be able to jump in and make a comment, or anyone else for that matter. So, Brenna, you mentioned the billionaires are now interested in investing their money into sustainability. Cumulatively, they have over $1 trillion. Where are they deploying their money, such as venture capital funds, stocks, public stocks, et cetera?
So what I would just say is that, if you look at, if you look at sort of the amount of money that is estimated to need to go into climate finance annually, there are various ways of measuring this and different, but you're looking at several trillions annually. And if you look at the wealth that's held, for example, by UBS, the world's largest wealth manager alone, you could get to a point where you quickly, just with money from private banking alone, would be able to stopgap the financing gap for climate finance annually. I would say that, of course, we've seen, I believe, Mary, you spoke on a greenwashing panel this morning, is that correct? You've seen a huge rise in so-called sustainable investing, but growing information around limitations to how much that sort of standard sustainable investing into private equities is really doing. Is it bringing about any change at all? You've seen, of course, a rise in green bonds, and you do have this area called impact investing, which I believe last year, by new assessments, for the first time exceeded the $1 trillion mark. So that is now it is now a niche that's with over $1 trillion in invested assets. And a lot of that is private investors. You have some institutional investors, but many people in the billionaire class are looking to get into that. I think a key concern sort of is what scope there is within mainstream finance to do that. So I've heard from a lot of bankers, for example, a client has come to us with an idea for a really interesting project where it's clear you're going to be building out important infrastructure, or maybe less on the tech side, preserving forests, but we have a responsibility to make sound financial decisions for them, and we don't really know how to risk assess that. And so we can't do it, and then you end up just you have to be truly, truly wealthy to say, okay, I'm gonna go outside the bank. I'm no longer using their investment vehicles. They're no longer gonna be advising me on this, and I'm gonna be doing my own thing. But I'd be curious to hear Mary's perspectives on that, because I think there would be room. There's a lot of people who'd like to do a whole lot more with their money.
Yeah.
Great. And
No,
just so that you know, we have 2 minutes left.
Okay. You know, I agree. I think more patient capital can take more risk. So you see that from family offices and other places, that they're investing in either accepting lower returns or longer time horizons for returns. I do think the statistics are pretty compelling. I think by 2025, 50% of assets under management will be managed to some type of ESG, which is environmental social governance criteria. So that is the trend. And I will say, you know, the large banks are all building up their sustainable finance and ESG advising staff to work with not only the high net worth individuals, but companies. You know, the companies oftentimes are ahead of the markets in terms of, you know, where they need to deploy capital. Certainly when we saw GM's large announcement about rapidly transitioning to all EV production, you think about the tremendous amount of assets they have to turn over and the capital that's going to be required to do that. And so I think the momentum is pretty strong. I do agree there's a little bit of there's politicization today of ESG and debate about whether asset managers have a fiduciary responsibility to include or not include ESG criteria in the assets they manage. But I think the momentum is definitely headed in that direction, and I don't see a change in that.
Thank you. And that concludes this panel. Thank you all for participating today and with the conference.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.